później to się po prostu wytnie część. To co, uchwycić slajdy?
Chyba tak.
Może
coś machnę potem ze 2 razy, no dobra, wjechał mi pan na ambitę, niech będzie.
No mogę tak zrobić, żeby...
Nie, slajdy proszę uchwycić raczej. Jeżeli już to obrócę ją tylko 2 razy na ambitę.
Dobra. No to ja idę jeść. Powodzenia.
Smacznego.
I'm just going to give you a minute or two. Right, it's 10 minutes past, so I should probably start. Thank you for coming. My name's Justin Parsler. I've got quite a mixed background. And I sort of wondered how to start this because the things I'm going to say about games education, some of them are quite contentious. And I sort of want to demonstrate to people that I'm not just a random person on stage expressing opinions and flapping my lips and talking, but that I have some understanding of what I'm talking about. But the problem with that is that if I start to talk about who I am endlessly, then I sound like one of these awful sort of American speakers who stands up and they're just promoting themselves and they're telling everybody how awesome they are. So I thought Ollie earlier got around this really well by sort of like just showing a graduation picture and that was it. And I thought maybe I'd show baby pictures or something and sort of like say, here's me when I'm 6. I'm going to talk through my life story. But I have got to talk about myself because otherwise you have no idea who I am. I could just be some random person on stage with no understanding of my subject. I made the first computer game I made in 1982, which I made on my own for the ZX Spectrum, which was a really big deal in the UK as a computer. I don't know, did you ever get ZX Spectrums in Poland?
Yes.
Yeah? I remember, I think I was about 14 years old, just waiting and waiting for this thing to come through the post. And I've been professionally working in games pretty much ever since. But I didn't spend most of my career in computer games. I worked for a live role-playing company. People familiar with live role-playing? Yeah? Everyone's looking slightly embarrassed now, imagining me dressed as an elf. But I worked in live role-playing for a while, and I spent quite a lot of my career in play-by-mail gaming. Play-by-mail? No? Yeah. So, well, back in the day, before we had the internet, that might be hard to imagine for some of you, but before we had the internet, people still wanted to play multiplayer games. but couldn't, because the computers weren't connected, and most people didn't have computers. So the way it worked is that a company would have the computer, and you would fill out your orders, and you would send them in by post, and they would put them into the computer, and they would print out the results, and they would send them back. Everyone's looking at me kind of bizarrely blankly now. And for about 10 years, this was huge business. It was huge business in Britain. It was huge business in America. And that desire never went away to play multiplayer games. But with the invention of the internet, all the computers are connected. I was running one of the most successful play-by-mail companies in the world, and there was no customers left. They just sort of abandoned because they could just do things through the internet. So I just sort of thought about what I was going to do, and I decided that I would take a year out and do a master's degree. I did a master's degree at Brunel University. And this is where it gets interesting, because I spent my life as an indie game developer. I mean, we bandy this term indie around, you know, but there was like me and 3 guys, and we were earning a living and working all night, and you know, it's about as indie as it came. And I didn't think that a university was going to be able to teach me anything at all about games or games design. I really didn't. I've been doing it for, you know, 15 years, maybe 20 years at the time professionally, and I really didn't think that a university was going to be able to tell me anything. I thought that I would go to university, I would get a nice piece of paper, and that would help me get jobs. And I was rapidly disabused of this notion about 2 weeks in. Suddenly I realised that actually this university could teach me a huge amount. And it didn't matter how much I knew about games already. I knew, in some aspects, more about games than the people who were teaching me were, and in other aspects I didn't. Over the next year, a whole new perspective of the way games work opened up for me. And as a result, I stayed in academia. I started teaching the design portion of the MA that I'd done. I still am. And those are the things I'm going to talk about. Just briefly to start with, the things that I do now, having filled in my exciting life story. I'm hoping that I've got very exciting slides as well. So there's the first bit about me. I've been teaching the master's degree for 6 years now. We've got a 60% games industry employment rate from that master's degree. Ollie and Owen, Zynga and Rovi over there, are both former students of mine. We have students at Creative Assembly, Rockstar, actually I'm Supermassive. I'm trying to think of game studios we don't have former students at now. All over. Not everybody who's done the master's degree has gone on to work in the industry. Not everybody who came to do the master's degree even wanted to work in the industry. The master's degree also does not exist merely to train people for the industry. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well. We started a joint honours BA. We started a single honours, joint honours BA, a single honours BA. And I'm moderately, though games research is often somewhat obscure, I'm a quite well published academic as well. So that's up there, not for me to do this American swagger about how wonderful I am, but just to point out that if I talk about games education, I'm worth listening to because I've done it. Okay? And this bit, as well as the background of my general life story, is to convince you that if I talk about games and the games industry, I've got some basis for being knowledgeable. I work for a company called Mediatonic. Mediatonic started from 2 Brunel students who I didn't teach in the corner of a science park at Brunel University, working off my laptop. When I joined it, they had about 15 to 20 employees. I think they're about 70 now, aiming for 100 by the end of the year. They're a meteoric growth of company. I am the senior designer at Mediatonic. We've worked on a low number of very large budget titles, which none of you would have heard of, but have made quite a lot of impact. You might have heard of Amateur Surgeon. Anyone? 65 million downloads. And we just launched a Facebook version. We've done a lot of work with Disney. We do a lot of work with Gier. We've got a lot of other work forthcoming. Really cutting edge social mobile freemium. Maybe you don't like freemium. That's certainly the vibe that I've got from this conference so far. We're not necessarily freemium fans. I'm not sure how I feel about freemium either. My thoughts are sort of like mixed and complicated. But I've got some, I've got some quite serious industry background as well. That's enough about sort of me. I'm not going to talk about me anymore. I want to talk about games design. And games design courses in Britain, I'm talking about Britain, I don't know whether the same is true in Poland, come in for a great deal of criticism. I mean, in the mainstream press, we quite often get articles like, a major developer, it never says who, but a major developer says that games course graduates are not prepared to work in the industry. We get this all the time. And this annoys me a great deal. So I wrote an article for Develop, which is online presently. And this is my answer to these criticisms. And it's not a direct answer to any of the criticisms that are leveled about games education by the industry, but rather it's an effort to say what's good about games education and why it matters. Because if I start getting into a debate with, with the industry about, or industry people about exactly what we should be doing, or I start answering their questions directly, then we just end up with a really negative conversation, and I would like to have a positive one instead. So the first one is this, that games design is a separate discipline, and games design is not programming. That's the big one. Games design is not programming. They are separate things. You see this conflation all the time, this idea that if you know how to program, you automatically know how to design games. You don't, and programmers are often, but not always, atrocious games designers. Like really, 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 really bad. I know that quite a lot of this convention has people that are part of the multimedia fusion or game maker communities. Is that true of many people in the audience? Okay. Those communities are wonderful groups of people that are full of really, really, really bad games designers. They're really keen and they're lovely, and I adore those communities to bits. I desperately want to pick those people up and shake them by the neck and say, you need to stop just thinking about what multimedia fusion can do and start thinking about, instead, what you should do with it. Games design, not programming. Games design, not animation. Games design is not about making a huge amount of money and knowing where the market is. It's not about any of those things. You need to understand all of those things, but it is a separate discipline. I'm hoping some people can argue with me about this at the end, but I will continue. The second thing is that that discipline can be taught. How do I know that? I know that because everything can be taught. There's nothing in the whole sphere of human existence that can't be taught. You're certainly teaching me about it just by mentioning it. But okay, we could get there if you wanted to. And I like going to those places, but just stop interfering with my point, okay? You can teach anything. Rembrandt ran an art school. Did all of the people who went to art school become Rembrandt? No, probably not, because they had different levels of talent. And this is the thing that gets confused here. You cannot teach a raw talent for games design. You know, you've got that, or you haven't. You've got a different degree of talent. What you can do is nurture that talent for games design. You can teach people practical skills for the application of games design. You can give people an environment in which they can practice games safely. Ollie, I think, said, stealing one of my quotes, that there is common wisdom that suggests the 21st games you make are rubbish. And that's not always true, because I know some people who've made some very good games early on. But it's generally true, and it's a good idea to get those rubbish games out of the way in a safe environment, surrounded by people who can give you positive criticism of them, both your fellow students and your lecturers. So teaching games design, you can do it. It's obvious you can do it because you can teach everything else. It's obvious to me because I have been doing it, and I've been doing it for 6 years. Before I started at Brunel, I wouldn't have believed that you could teach games design. I would have been, with what I think are a lot of people who are involved in the making of games, believing that it was not something that you could teach. Those people are wrong. They're just wrong. Most things in life are open to debate, but whether you can teach games design or not just isn't open to debate. You just can. It's just demonstrable. Yeah, I'm there with that. This is the next good stuff point, and that's the idea that theory is useful. I don't know. Maybe the word I don't know whether the word theory translates very well, but if you would use the word theoretical outside of a science subject in Britain, the concept that comes to mind is of dusty old scholars sitting in ivory towers, not really connected to the world at all, thinking deep thoughts that don't matter, unable to tie their shoelaces or brush their teeth. That's really not what theory is. It can become that. Theory can become something that is studied just to its own end, but that's not its, sort of not to my mind anyway, not its main purpose. Theory informs the world around us, and theory really influences the world around us. I think it's Hayek, who was an economist, said that most of mankind is enslaved to a dead political economist. We're all enslaved to different dead political economists, depending on what system we're under. But theory is irrelevant to the world. And when we think about theory in relation to computer games, there is a roughly similar analogy between an architect and a bricklayer, and a games designer and a programmer. Now, I know I'm abusing programs quite a lot here, and I would firstly like to say that they're all lovely people, but also that a lot of programmers are extremely skilled at their job, and a lot of programmers are also games designers, but they are a separate discipline. Games design is a very theoretical science, and it is a thing that is very much associated with thought processes. And all theory really is, at its bottom line, is a whole load of different ways of thinking about the world. Theory is just ways of thinking. It's nothing more than that, but it's nothing less than that either. And anything that you can do or learn that helps you think about the world around you is going to help you in a job that requires you to think. This is the next one. We might have flashbacks, we'll probably flash back through these as people disagree with us. Education and training are two different things. And this is like really well established in educational theory. Training is the process of learning how to do something. So I could be trained to learn 3D Studio Max. I could probably be trained to use 3D Studio Max in my week. Photoshop. Training is about teaching something really specific. Education is about teaching people how to learn anything. In Britain, we have a sort of, I don't know how it works in Poland, we have a sort of tiered education system in that you probably stay at school, you're likely to stay at school until you're 18 and you do A-levels, which I think you've got an equivalent of. Yeah, you do some exams at 16, and then if you do well enough, you'll do some more exams at 18. Now the gap between 16 and 18 is generally called further education. And in further education, you're trained how to do something. And then you might go on to another, a trade-specific training school. That tends to be called further education. We also have higher education. Higher education is much more about education than training. And in Britain, universities are generally about education. Now, while they're educating people, they might also be training them to do something, because that's the way that you learn. You learn how to learn by learning something. It's all very useful. But a good education is of value for absolutely the rest of your life, in everything that you do. Learning how to learn, which can be taught and has been taught for centuries. Learning how to do that is absolutely valuable. That's what universities do. Certainly at the moment in Britain we're having a little bit of trouble with that, because our government is very, very keen. I don't know how it is over here, I see people nodding, but our government is very, very keen that we all learn skills that will contribute to the economy. And those things are important, but they miss out the point that it becomes much easier to learn skills that contribute to the economy, which you really care about the economy, if you've got a good education. And for a games course, giving a good education as well. First off, you get to have a good education while learning about games, which is like pretty much more interesting to me than having a good education while learning about Shakespeare. But secondly, it's a transferable education. It's not necessarily an education which will only be of use within the gaming sector. It's an education that might be of use to you for your whole life, an education for life. We have a saying, we got a dog protection saying from a group of the Royal Society for Protection of Animals that we get every Christmas. And it goes, a dog is for life, not just for Christmas. The idea being that you shouldn't buy pets for people just as a Christmas present, because then they'll pack them and they'll die. But this is true of education as well. And education is something which lasts an entire lifetime, whereas the ability to use 3D Studio Max may not be useful in 5 years' time. This is the answer to every industry criticism of games education. If the industry turns around to us and says, you there, you're not serving my interests as the boss of this company, my answer is, it's not my job to serve your interests. It's my job to serve my students' interests. Now, in serving my students' interests, that is going to mean I want them to get employment, so I'm going to teach them how to come and work for you. But I'm not here to produce what we would call in English cube monkeys to serve your needs. And we get this. I mean, at Brunel we're quite lucky because we've got a lot of industry ties, and most of us have worked in both the industry and academia. So there is quite a close relationship. But the industry trying to dictate, I don't know whether they do this in Poland, but they do this in Poland, is an attempt to dictate to universities how they would teach, is completely inappropriate, because the industry doesn't know how to teach, the industry doesn't understand education. Most programs which are so-called run by industry professionals are an absolute disaster, because those people do not know how to teach, do not understand education, and in a lot of cases barely understand training. But the most important point here is that universities serve their students. They don't serve any other interest at all. In serving their students, they serve wider society, they serve industry, they might serve their students' parents, you never know. But the relationship is always between a university and its student. It is the students who universities serve. I don't know what else I've got here. Oh, I'll write on to any questions. There's a point I didn't make in the Develop article, which is a question of institutional memory. And it didn't really suit the Develop article because it was like 1,000 words and you can't really discuss very much. But there is an issue, there's an ongoing issue with the games industry, that people leave it. They leave it quite soon. Most people who go, certainly the last generation of games designers went and worked for games companies and then stopped at age 30. Because the culture around games design was that you worked 12 hours a day and you weren't paid very much, and you were always in crunch, you never went home, and you just lived on pizza. And that's absolutely fine when you're in your 20s, but by the time you reach your 30s and you want to get married and you want to sort of like settle down and think about having some sort of other life and just making computer games isn't appealing, those people all left the games industry. And this is not so bad now, it's getting better as the industry grows up, and especially as it moves into the casual market where there's starting to employ a lot of different sorts of people to make games. But it does mean that we lose institutional memory. The games industry has forgotten what it did 10 or 20 years ago. The games industry has tended to forget all of the lessons we learned from board games, it's tended to forget all of the lessons we learned from live role-playing games, it's tending to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And one of the things that universities can do is take that knowledge, hold on to it, write it down, pass it on to a new group of students so we can start to progress a little bit more. And I really think that this is one of the big things that has held games back. I really do think they have been held back for the last 10 years. Is that we've just reinvented the same thing time and time again. And that's only just started to change. So we'll go, I've no idea how long I've been. 25 minutes. I was aiming for half an hour, so that's not too bad. Any questions? Yes.
About the content of what you teach in the design program. For university is launching a new BA program next year. It's called Digital Humanities.
Okay.
It makes landscape, literature, and culture and skills with social media and computer use. And I'm trying to encourage the authority to launch a specialization in game studies, game design. I read your paper, I read some of that debate about the usefulness, practicality of game studies. One thing that is frequently mentioned, even by people who want to defend the sense of game practice, is that the transferability of a game design skill set is relatively low. A programmer can easily start doing something else in programming. The graphic artist, likewise. But a game designer, it doesn't work in the industry. It's difficult to find. What I came up with a solution.
Well,
but should be also teaching gamification, how to design gamified systems.
yeah, the thing is that if you so first off, if you can do proper games design, you can do gamification really easily. Gamification is not very difficult, comparably. Games are quite complex mechanisms. I don't know, do you pronounce it gamification? Gamification. I always want to call it gamification. I really don't like it. I think it's wrong in a whole load of ways, these ideas of gamification. But I won't make a debate about that. I'll stay quite neutral on that, whether it's any good or not. But gamification is just about using the reward systems from games and applying them to other real-world systems. And that's really a little bit of what a games designer does. So I think if you teach games design, you are implicitly teaching gamification. but I challenge, I mean, I don't agree with the non-transferable skills things. I think that's one thing that industry wants to happen. If I'm running a big computer game company, what I would quite like is for universities to concentrate on training staff with precisely the skills that I might need. And then some of those won't get jobs, and I don't care because I'm the company, and it means I get the pick of a set of people who are training for exactly what I want. And by concentrating on education over training, first off, you make, and education is always transferable. By concentrating, but then if you think about the skills that are relevant to games designers, a great deal of those revolve around communication and presentation skills. Half of a games designer's job is about communication in one form or another, and that's an extremely transferable skill. A portion of games design is about the creation of complex systems. And those complex systems apply themselves to all sorts of management roles as well. I just don't agree that the skills aren't transferable unless the institute that's teaching them surrenders to this idea that they should teach a very narrow set of skills that are applicable to the industry right now. I mean, does that answer your question, or is that is there more Polish debate around that?
Well, my question would be simply gamification should be. Do you think that gamification should be part of what we teach at game design courses?
Yeah, I think
that's my question.
I think the feedback mechanisms have to be part of what we teach, and they are gamification. So, and it's certainly worth it.
I just wanted to add something to this. The author of, I think, a very popular game design book, The Art of Game Design, is by trade works at Disney and designs theme parks. He's not making video games. So this is another area where you directly use the same skills practically.
That's very true.
There is another thing. Last year we had started in Poznań certain kind of a meeting of interface designers, and a lot of people who came up, who came to this meeting were actually experienced designers. Experience design is not just about designing games, it's about designing restaurants, for example, so that you have optimal experience in this restaurant, or designing, I don't know, cinemas and things like that. And I think that practically all the things skills, not just education, you have as a game designer helps in experience design.
Well, yeah, and games design's in a peculiar position because people are always asking us, are you teaching useful skills? They're not really chasing English literature courses and asking them, are you teaching skills that are relevant to the English literature industry? There's a slightly different standard being applied. And it's worth studying games. I mean, I think it's more worth studying games than it is worth studying literature, personally, because they're more relevant to our lives. But we sit in that uneasy space between a sort of vocational course on something that's teaching you how to do something, and a more general area of study. That sort of answers both your questions. Again, I keep answering your question. But yeah, there is a huge number of transferable skills there. And of course the question is always, compared to it, games education if games education has an amount of transferable skills, what are we comparing it to? Are we comparing it to a doctor? Because a medical doctor doesn't have very many transferable skills. They're only really useful for fixing sick people. So what happens if they want to do something else? Is criticising those. Lawyers don't necessarily have very many transferable skills. I would suggest that people who study games have more transferable skills than either of those two sets of people. Either of those two sets of people now burst through the door and kill you with nose. So. Any more questions?
You mentioned, sorry, I'm monopolizing. You mentioned that the industry professionals are horrible at teaching. They tend to be. Of course,
that's actually not what. That's a little bit of what I said. The thing is that knowing how to make computer games and knowing how the industry works is a different skill from teaching. And those elements of the industry who have thought that they can just start teaching better than the people who are teaching without learning how to do it are idiots.
Okay, so that really surprised me because I always thought that game design, a large part of game design is the knowledge of how, at least a feeling of how people's minds work, and that includes of how people learn. Because a lot of fun in games comes from learning, obviously, and you cannot design for that if you don't at least have some idea of how that works in people.
That's very true.
So I would guess that would help in teaching too.
I'm reasonably convinced that most good game designers could become good teachers. I'm just arguing the point that they're not automatically good teachers. And that there is often a certain level of arrogance that blinds that transition, the assumption that the academic world doesn't know what it's doing. Whereas in fact the academic world does know what it's doing and it understands the constraints. And games, it understands the constraints of teaching. And games designers should really appreciate this because people who make games are constantly being criticised for not doing better by people who don't know anything about games design. Especially on forums, you go to any forum and there'll be people say, oh, you should have done this, and you should have done this, and you should have done this. And the games designer's like, well, you don't really understand the real constraints of what you should have done. And then elements of the industry do that to academia, saying you should have done this, and you should have done this, and you should have done this. And the answer is, well, you don't really understand the constraints that we're working under. So maybe not. There's some, I won't name any, but there's some slightly dubious training courses, certainly in the UK at the moment, that are home study courses. Do you get this phenomenon? Do you get these in Poland at all? They're a bit of a thing in the UK. When I was growing up, there were these articles in newspapers that said, learn to become an author, send us this amount of money and you can do this correspondence course over however many weeks or months. And the same is being done in computer games now, and it's become quite big business. I'm very suspicious of courses that aren't backed by at least some authoritative education organisation. Any more questions? Yeah, go.
As far as I know, there's also in Berlin University of Science, in which you can study the game design. Maybe have you heard of it? And could you see the?
I haven't.
So.
No, I haven't. One thing I don't know about that course in particular. Yes, no, I don't know. What I do know though is that if it is a course associated with a European university, it's not necessarily true in America because America has different rules. But if it's a course associated with a European university, it's almost certainly the people who have prepared that course have had to go through rigorous, rigorous numbers of meetings and checks and balances and a very detailed examination of that course. So if it's backed by a university, it's probably not completely rubbish. I don't know that course particularly, but when looking at a university course, things to look for are whether there are people on faculty who are published in their area and how well they're published. In the case of games design, whether there is anybody on faculty who has ever designed a game. I don't necessarily mean commercial, I don't necessarily mean a big commercial game, but who's ever done anything in the way of games design that you can look at Yeah, go, well, look, this is something this person's done. And it's better if they've got some industry affiliation as well, but it's quite difficult to get industry affiliation in games. The games industry is very much where friends talk to friends, so if there is nobody on the course who is involved with the industry, it will be very difficult to get any speakers there, and that doesn't necessarily make them a bad course, because there are a lot of people struggling with that. It's one of the reasons for this article. In fact, one of the things that I finished off with is that I very much like more small studios and more developers to get involved with local universities, and to get involved with them in a reasonably gentle way, rather than sort of, you must teach this, and we'll tell you what to do, but rather to sort of like, to meet in the middle with the university from now. So I'll look at those things for the university. But there's the IT University in Copenhagen as well, which is great. I mean, there are good universities all over teaching games design very well. And of course, there's Brunel University, which is better than all of them by a very little way. Any more questions? Did that answer yours? Did that answer yours? Well, mostly because I didn't know how to answer yours. Syllabus-wise, though, you know, the way that you teach games design, that's still really in debate because it's quite young, so we're all trying to work out how we do it best. Questions? We're all happy with it. So you all agree with everything I've said? Yeah? Well, if you don't agree with what I've said, tell me why. I like a good argument.
I'm going to ask you actually a practical question. Where would I go looking for academic papers on game design?
So there is a problem here, because most academic papers are about games, not about games design. So you need to read the academic paper and then make the leap to how you think about applying it. That's slowly changing, but if you go to Game Studies or the Journal of Gaming in Virtual Worlds or Strategy and Simulation, there are a number of really good publications that publish very, very high quality, mostly culturally focused work. And they are generally written by skilled and experienced academics, but they're coming from a very cultural perspective. So they're reading and analysing the game. They're not necessarily so interested in precisely how it's designed, so that's not what they're writing about. But if you are interested in how to make something, those theoretical papers inform design. I mean, there's not very many good games design books around. Most of them say the very, very obvious things, or teach you how to use a particular piece of software. So obviously the ones that teach you how to use a particular piece of software are quite good, if you want to learn how to use that piece of software. The ones that say things like, hey, you have characters and you should plan what you do, and then you use a computer. There's quite a lot of those. I quite like Ernest Adams' new one, Machinations it's called. Rules of Play is a good old favourite. And there are a number of very strong game studies texts. Some of them are quite old now. Hamlet on the Holodeck by Janet Murray, Cyber Text by Espen Arseth, and Tomb Raiders and Space Invaders, which is by which is my favourite really, because that answers that's always one of the baselines for game studies. But academic papers that are directly related to the process of games design are almost unknown. In a how-to guide. Any more questions? You disagree with me over there. I say you agree with me. Okay. That was an easy argument. Okay, I'll leave it there, I guess.